Welcome to today's Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here today because we're about to unpack an incredible, invisible narrative that is literally happening all around us every single second of the day. We're looking at the ecosystem. Today, we're going to trace the astonishing journey of solar energy as it travels through the natural world, transforming into matter, sustaining life, and eventually recycling right back into the earth. It's a brilliantly dynamic machine, and I promise you, by the time we're done here, you're going to look at every plant, every insect, and every patch of dirt in a completely new way.
Okay, let's just dive right into this. To understand this massive machinery, we need to ground ourselves with a clear definition. An ecosystem is a functional unit of nature. It's where living organisms interact not just with each other, but intimately with their surrounding physical environment. And what's really fascinating is how drastically this can scale. An ecosystem isn't just a massive, sprawling jungle. It varies wildly in size. We're talking about anything from a tiny localized small pond in your backyard, a vast desert, a man-made crop field, or even an aquarium. In fact, many ecologists look at the absolute biggest picture and regard the entire global biosphere as one single composite ecosystem.
To make sense of this grand biological machine, here's our blueprint for today. We're covering 1. Welcome to the ecosystem. 2. Productivity, capturing solar power. 3. Energy flow and food webs. 4. The ecological pyramids. And finally, 5. Decomposition, nature's ultimate recyclers. Think of this as the organized blueprint of life on Earth.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1. Welcome to the ecosystem, the functional unit of nature.
For any ecosystem to actually work, 4 interlocking pillars must operate together continuously: productivity, decomposition, energy flow, and nutrient cycling. Let's look back at that simple pond ecosystem we mentioned earlier just to see this in action. The shallow water and sunlight allow autotrophs, like phytoplankton and algae, to produce energy. That's your productivity. Then consumers like free-swimming zooplankton eat the algae. That is energy flow. Finally, at the very bottom of the pond, decomposers like fungi and bacteria break down whatever dies. That covers decomposition and nutrient cycling. It's all 4 components working in perfect harmony in a single puddle of water.
Moving on to Section 2, productivity and capturing solar power. This is where it all kicks off, the moment sunlight actually hits the Earth.
We tend to think of the sun as this boundless source of energy, right? But the reality of what actually enters the biological world is shockingly narrow. Of all the incident solar radiation that hits our planet, less than 50% is what we call photosynthetically active radiation, or PAR. And of that PAR, plants capture a mere 2 to 10%. That is literally it. That tiny 2 to 10% fraction of sunlight is the sliver of power that sustains the entire living, breathing world. No pressure, right?
So once that energy is captured during photosynthesis, it's converted into biomass, and this brilliantly illustrates how nature operates almost exactly like a financial budget. We have gross primary productivity, or GPP, which is the total rate of organic matter produced. Think of this as the ecosystem's gross income. But plants have to live and breathe too, so a considerable amount of that GPP is utilized by the plants in respiration, represented by R. That's basically nature's operating tax. When you subtract respiration from the GPP, you are left with net primary productivity, or NPP. That NPP is the net profit. It's the actual available biomass left over for heterotrophs, meaning the consumers like herbivores and decomposers, to eat. When we zoom out and calculate this biological net profit for the entire global biosphere, the annual net primary productivity sits at approximately 170 billion tons of dry weight organic matter. But when you break down the numbers, there's a staggering disparity of scale here. Despite the oceans covering roughly 70% of the Earth's surface, their productivity is only 55 billion tons. The land, which makes up far less surface area, absolutely dominates by producing 115 billion tons of biomass.
So the land and oceans have created all this massive biomass. What happens next? That brings us to Section 3, energy flow and food webs. This newly captured energy is going to travel through food chains, and there are 2 main types you really need to know. First up is the grazing food chain, or GFC. This is the one we're all most familiar with. It begins with living producers. For example, grass is eaten by a primary consumer like a goat, which is then eaten by a secondary consumer like a human. But equally important is the detritus food chain, or DFC. Now this chain begins entirely with dead organic matter. It relies on saprotrophs, mainly fungi and bacteria, that get their nutrients by secreting extracellular enzymes to break down dead, decaying material. In aquatic ecosystems, the grazing food chain is the major conduit for energy, but on land, a much larger fraction of energy actually flows through the detritus food chain.
But let's be real, in the actual world, nature rarely operates in a straight, isolated line. Enter the food web. Animals like cockroaches and crows are omnivores. They're opportunists, just like us, meaning they pull from multiple different chains simultaneously. These natural interconnections transformed isolated lines into a highly complex, interconnected food web. It's like a giant puzzle. As energy moves up these chains, from producers to primary consumers to secondary consumers, and eventually to top carnivores, you might be wondering, why do food chains usually cap out at just 3 or 4 levels? I mean, why not 10 levels? Well, the answer lies in a strict natural tax called the 10% law. As energy is transferred to each successive trophic level, the vast majority is simply lost as heat. Only 10% of the energy is successfully transferred up to the next tier.
Which perfectly sets up Section 4, the Ecological Pyramids. Let's see how this 10% tax builds into a visual representation of biomass and energy.
In most ecosystems, these pyramids, whether we're measuring the number of organisms, the energy, or the biomass, are upright. And this makes total intuitive sense based on that 10% law we just talked about. The base of the pyramid, representing the producers at the first trophic level, is incredibly wide, and it tapers to a very narrow apex for the top tertiary consumers. To put that into perspective, in a grassland ecosystem, a pyramid of numbers might require an unbelievable 6 million plants at the base just to support 3 top carnivores at the apex. Crazy, right?
But there's a fascinating exception to the rule here. An energy pyramid is absolutely always upright. It can never be inverted because, as we know, energy is inevitably lost at each step. But if we look at the pyramid of biomass in a marine ecosystem, it subverts our expectations completely. It's actually inverted. The total dry mass of the tiny producers, the phytoplankton, is much, much less than the biomass of the fish that consume them.
And now, we've reached the end of the line for energy flow. Section 5, Decomposition, nature's ultimate recyclers.
You can't talk about decomposition without mentioning detritivores, and perhaps the most famous one of all is the humble earthworm. It's widely referred to as the farmer's friend, and for really good reason. Earthworms help break down complex dead plant remains and fecal matter, which we collectively call detritus, while simultaneously loosening up the soil. But the earthworm is really just the opening act. Decomposition actually involves 5 critical steps. First, fragmentation breaks the detritus into smaller bits. Next comes leaching, where water-soluble nutrients seep down into the soil. Third is catabolism. This is where bacterial and fungal enzymes aggressively degrade the material into simpler substances. Fourth, humification creates a dark, microbe-resistant substance called humus. And finally, mineralization degrades that humus, releasing the raw inorganic nutrients right back into the wild.
Now, this massive recycling effort doesn't just happen at a uniform speed everywhere. Decomposition is largely an oxygen-requiring process, and its speed is heavily dependent on both the chemical composition of the detritus and the climate. If the detritus is rich in nitrogen and water-soluble substances like sugars, and the environment happens to be warm and moist, decomposition is remarkably fast. Conversely, if the material is packed with tough structural compounds like lignin, which you find in wood, or chitin, found in insect exoskeletons, the process slows down to an absolute crawl.
So the absolutely crucial point here is that this final step of mineralization guarantees nutrient cycling. Once broken down, elements return to the ecosystem's reservoirs. Gaseous cycles, like carbon, have their reservoir in the atmosphere and hydrosphere. Sedimentary cycles, like phosphorus, have their reservoir deep down in the Earth's crust. This constant, elegant return of nutrients completes the beautiful, infinite loop of the ecosystem, ensuring the producers have exactly what they need to capture the sun's energy all over again.
Which brings us to a final, compelling thought I want to leave you with. We've seen how meticulously structured this system is. Yet amazingly, saprophytes, the very organisms making decomposition possible, aren't even given a place in our ecological pyramids, despite their absolutely vital role. It just goes to show how much happens right out of sight. Given that strict 10% energy tax we discussed, think about how precarious this makes life at the top. If only 10% of energy survives each leap up the food chain, what happens to the fragile balance of the entire ecosystem when the base is even slightly disrupted? It's definitely something to ponder. Thank you so much for exploring the invisible machinery of nature with me in this explainer. Until next time, keep questioning the world around you.